The Tim Hortons on Burrard Street was doing what Tim Hortons always does at 7:40 on a Wednesday morning, running behind and pretending not to be. Nathan Colby stood fourth in line with his last $40 folded in the front pocket of his jacket and his severance letter still in the inner breast pocket, where he'd put it 2 hours ago when he'd signed it. He had not known what else to do with it. You couldn't throw it away in front of your manager. You couldn't fold it into your coat and forget it was there. It sat where it sat. The woman ahead of him was trying to pay for 2 coffees and a breakfast sandwich. Her card declined on the first tap. She tried again. The machine beeped the kind of beep that sounds like an apology and means nothing of the sort. She dug in her bag. She found a second card. It declined too. The woman behind the counter looked at no one in particular. The line shifted. Nathan stepped forward and put 2 20s on the counter. For hers, and whatever the difference is, keep it. He didn't wait for the woman to turn around. He picked up his medium dark roast and left. If you've ever believed that the way you treat a stranger on your worst morning says more about you than anything else, stay with us. What happens to Nathan next will change how you think about the word enough. The drive from downtown Vancouver back to New Westminster took 41 minutes in morning traffic. Nathan made it in 53. The Civic had 312,000 kilometers on it and a heating system that worked on its own schedule, and on this particular morning, in late November, it had decided not to work at all. He parked on the street outside the duplex on Edinburgh Street, sat for a moment with the engine running because it was still slightly warmer inside the car than out, and then turned it off and went up the front steps. Maisie was in the kitchen. She was 6 years old, and she was eating cereal at the table, and she was wearing one red sock and one sock with a polar bear on it, which was more or less how she handled every morning. Her backpack was already on. She put it on after breakfast day sometimes during. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, Bug. Where's the other red one?" She looked at her feet with genuine interest, as though the answer might arrive if she waited. "I think it's still being washed." "Okay. The polar bear one is better anyway." She considered this. "Polar bears are very strong." "Very strong," he said. He set his coffee on the counter. He walked past her to the bedroom, opened the bottom dresser drawer, and put the envelope under a stack of sweaters that had belonged to his wife and that he had not been able to do anything with in the 2 years since the accident on the Coquihalla. He stood there for a moment, with his hand still on the wood. The drawer smelled like her shampoo still, or he told himself it did. He was no longer certain whether the smell was real. He pulled up his banking app in the bathroom. $62 and change. Rent was due in 18 days. His ROE would take time to process. He had a call with an employment counselor the following Tuesday, which was the earliest available appointment. "Daddy?" "Yeah, Bug. Can I have hot chocolate when I get home?" He opened the cupboard above the stove, a tin of cocoa with about 3 servings left and a box of powdered milk. "We can do that." "With the little marshmallows?" He'd used the last of the little marshmallows on the weekend. He'd used them to say yes to something on a day when everything else was saying no. "I'll get more today." She hopped off her chair and pulled her boots on without untying them the way she always did, the way he'd stopped correcting her on 6 months ago because some things had to be chosen. He walked her to school. He walked her every day, regardless of weather, regardless of how early he'd been awake. He had made this decision 2 years ago standing outside Kelowna General in a parking lot at 5 in the morning, and he had not unmade it since. She held his hand on the corner of 6th and McBride and asked him if today was a day he was working. He said, "Not today, Bug. But that's okay. Some days are for figuring things out." She thought about it. "Like a puzzle." "Yeah, like a puzzle," she nodded. She went through the school doors. She did not look back. She never looked back. His wife had been the same way. The kind of person who walked into a room like she'd already decided it was going to be fine. He did not go back to the apartment. He walked to the grocery store on 6th Avenue and bought a small bag of mini marshmallows, a can of soup, a box of macaroni, and a bag of apples. He paid with the card and watched the total. He still had $31. He sat on a bench outside the store for a long time. Around him, New Westminster moved the way a city moves on a Wednesday when most people have somewhere to be. 3 days after the Tim Hortons on Burrard, Celeste Merrick went back. She had told herself she was not going to. She had told herself she was too busy, which was true. She was always too busy. She had told herself the man had been a stranger, and that was what strangers sometimes did, and you accepted it, and you moved forward, which was also true. She went back on a Saturday morning, before her first call, which was at 9. The Tim Hortons on Burrard opened at 6. She was there at 6:12. She asked the woman behind the counter if there was a way to find out who had paid for her order on Wednesday. The woman, whose name tag said Priya, looked at her for a moment and then called her manager over from the back. The manager was a young man named Devon who was not supposed to share anything from the transaction log, but who recognized Celeste from the business section of the Vancouver Sun and decided that this qualified as an unusual enough situation to make an exception. He pulled the receipt. The card was a Visa debit. The name on it was N. Colby. She thanked them both. She bought the two people in line behind her their orders without asking what they were. She went out to her car and sat in the parking lot and opened her laptop. N. Colby, Vancouver area. She had a good researcher on staff, a woman named Frances Pell who had been with Celeste Company since before Celeste had owned it and who could find almost anything without being asked how. But Celeste did not call Frances. Not yet. She sat in the car and did this part herself. N. Colby, Nathan Colby, Senior Infrastructure Analyst, Merrick Logistics and Supply, Vancouver office. She sat very still. Nathan Colby had been one of 43 people let go from Merrick Logistics on Wednesday morning. Celeste had not signed the individual termination letters. Her VP of Operations had. She had signed the restructuring authorization, which was not the same thing, and she had known it was not the same thing, and she had done it anyway because the alternative was a loss that threatened the whole company and not just 43 positions, and she had made the call and lived with it, was continuing to live with it. She drove to the office. She called Frances from the lobby. I need a current address for a former employee. Nathan Colby. Full package, whatever you can find in the next hour. Frances said, should I be concerned? Celeste said, no, I just owe someone something. Frances did not ask anything further. This was one of the reasons she had lasted 22 years in a company that had changed ownership twice. By 11 o'clock, Celeste was parked on Edinburgh Street in New Westminster in front of a side-by-side duplex with a bicycle on the porch of the right-hand unit and a pair of small rubber yellow ducks on them. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out. She knocked. The door opened. A man in a flannel shirt and old jeans looked at her and went very still. He recognized her. Of course he recognized. She held out his $40, the two 20s she had borrowed from her assistant, because she never carried cash and had been too flustered that morning to think clearly, and an envelope. Mr. Colby. He said, it was nothing. It was $40. On the morning you were let go from a job, it wasn't nothing. He looked at the envelope. He did not take it. She said, it's not a check. It's just something I'd like you to read. He said, Ms. Merrick, I know who you are. I think you should probably just keep that. She had expected this. She set the envelope on the wooden railing of the porch and took a step back. There was a sound from inside. A small voice saying, Daddy, is the pizza here? He turned. He said, not yet, Bug. Back in a sec. He turned back. Celeste looked past his shoulder for exactly 2 seconds, past the hallway, into a kitchen with a small table and 2 chairs and a child's drawing taped to the wall above the light switch, the kind of drawing that is clearly a dog even though it has 6 legs. And on the counter a shelf with some books stacked sideways on top of a row of standing ones, and on top of the sideways stack, a journal with a spine she recognized. She had published that journal. Her company had funded the infrastructure risk series it appeared in. She had read every piece in it, or nearly every piece. She had read that particular piece twice 3 years ago before the restructuring she'd done in 2022. She had cited it in an internal memo and not attributed it because she hadn't wanted to invite questions about her source material. The author's name was on the spine in small type. N. Colby. She stood there for 3 seconds. Then she picked the envelope back up. She said, I forgot to say something when I came up. She looked at him directly. Mr. Colby, I'm sorry for what happened on Wednesday. Not just the coffee. She went down the steps. She got into the car. She sat at the wheel for a long time before she started the engine. When she drove away, she looked once in the rearview mirror. He was still standing in the doorway. Nathan ate pizza with Maisie that night from a box they'd picked up at the place on Carnarvon that let you add toppings a la carte for cheaper than the combos if you knew to ask. She had mushrooms and pineapple. He had whatever she didn't finish. After she was in bed, he looked up Celeste Merrick. He had worked for her company for 4 years. He had met her once at an all-staff event the year before, and she had shaken his hand and moved on in the way that senior leadership shakes hands at all-staff events. He had not expected her to show up at his door. He did not quite know what to do with the fact that she had. He read for an hour. Her background was in municipal infrastructure. She had bought Marek Logistics from the original founders 11 years ago, when the company was half its current size and struggling, and had built it methodically, without a lot of fanfare, in the way that certain kinds of good operators build things. She gave to 3 charities. She sat on the board of the BC Children's Hospital Foundation. She had a daughter, if the one mention he found was accurate, though she didn't seem to talk about her publicly. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark. He thought about the envelope on the railing. He had picked it up after she drove away. He had not opened it yet. It was on the kitchen table. He opened it. Inside was a business card. Celeste Marek, President and CEO, Marek Logistics and Supply. On the back, in handwriting that was smaller and neater than he would have expected, the infrastructure risk piece from 2021. I owe you a conversation. He turned the card over twice. He set it face up on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went to check on Maisie. She was asleep with her arm around a stuffed otter and her mouth slightly open and her polar bear sock still on foot from that morning, because she had come home from school and gone directly to her homework without taking her shoes off, and he had let it go because she'd done the homework without being asked. Which was the win worth protecting? He tucked her blanket up and turned off her lamp. He came back to the kitchen and looked at the card again. He did not call. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. 4 days later, at 8:40 in the morning, his phone rang. He was at the library on 6th Street, where he had been coming every day since Wednesday to use the Wi-Fi and look for contract work and sit somewhere that wasn't the apartment, which had started to feel, since Wednesday, like a room he was waiting in. He stepped out into the cold. She said, "I have a problem I'd like to talk through with someone who understands it. Not a job offer, just a conversation." "I know that's a strange ask given the circumstances." He said, "Ms. Marek, you let me go 4 days ago." "I know. I'm not asking you to pretend that's not what happened. I'm asking for an hour. Coffee or call, your preference." He stood on the sidewalk. A TransLink bus went by. He thought about the envelope and the card and the name on the spine of the journal and the 2 seconds she'd stood on its porch after she'd already said goodbye. His preference was not to want to know what the problem was. He already wanted to know what the problem was. He said, "There's a place on Columbia Street. Birch and Brine, they open at 9. She said, "I'll be there." She was already at a table when he arrived, in a dark coat with no visible jewelry, and she was not on her phone, which he noticed. She had a coffee. She had ordered nothing else, which told him she had not assumed he would eat. He ordered a coffee. He sat down. She didn't ease into it. She said, "I have a provincial infrastructure contract that comes up for review in 6 weeks. $340 million over 5 years, supplying logistics coordination to 8 regional health authorities across BC. I've held it for 7 years. I've held it through 2 provincial governments and 1 pandemic and a supply chain crisis that nearly broke us in 2021. He waited. She said, "There's a competitor called Northfield Group. They've been positioning for this contract for 18 months. Their bid is going to be aggressive, but that's not the problem. I compete with aggressive bids. The problem is the review committee has a new chair, appointed 3 months ago, and she comes from Northfield's parent company. She recused herself from the original shortlist process, but the appeal window, if we lose the initial award, falls within her purview." "What's the appeal process?" She said, "That's exactly the right question." They talked for 2 hours. He had not meant to talk for 2 hours. He had meant to drink 1 coffee and have 1 conversation and leave with the same amount of information he had arrived with, which was manageable. Instead, he found himself sketching a risk map on the back of a napkin and asking to see the contract language, and she pulled it up on her phone and handed it to him across the table, and he read 3 clauses standing in a coffee shop in New Westminster in a flannel shirt on a Tuesday morning, which was not what he had been doing a week ago. He said, "There's a disclosure gap in Clause 14.3. It doesn't require Northfield to disclose subsidiary relationships more than 2 tiers deep. Their parent has a shell company that donated to the current minister's campaign fund. That's the angle they're protecting." Celeste was very still. He said, "I'm not saying that changes anything on its own. I'm saying it's the kind of thing that matters if you ever need to contest the process." She said, "I know. I've had 2 lawyers and 3 analysts look at this contract. None of them said that." He looked out the window. A woman walked by with a double stroller and the expression of someone who had been awake since 4. He said, "Ms. Merrick, I'm not looking to go back into this kind of work. I drive my daughter to school every morning, and I pick her up every afternoon, and I've done that for 2 years, and I'm not going to stop doing that." She said, "I'm not asking you to stop anything. I'm asking for 2 or 3 weeks your own hours around her schedule. I'll pay you fairly, whatever you think is fair." He said, "That's not a good negotiating position." She said, "I know, I'm not negotiating, I'm asking." He looked at his coffee. He had been doing contract work before Merrick, before the accident, and he had been good at it, and he had been good at it because he had cared about it, and caring about it had cost him time, and time was the only thing he had learned in the last 2 years to protect. He said, "Let me think about it." She said, "Okay." She paid for the coffees, both of them, without commenting on it. He noticed and did not say so, and she caught him noticing and also did not say so. He drove home. He picked Maisie up at 3:15. She told him about a boy at school named Jordan who had said that polar bears were not as strong as lions, and she had told him he was wrong and he had said, "Prove it." Nathan said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said the internet's right there, Jordan." He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window, satisfied. He did not say anything. He kept driving. That night, after she was asleep, he opened his laptop. He searched the Northfield Group's corporate filings. He searched the BC government's campaign finance disclosure database. He searched the minutes of the Provincial Infrastructure Review Committee from the last 3 years. The shape of it came together the way these things always did, slowly, and then all at once. Northfield's parent company, a holding group called Dunbar Capital, had a subsidiary called Meridian Advisory Services. Meridian had made 3 separate donations to the provincial minister's re-election fund within a single 12-month window, all below the individual reporting threshold, all in different contributor names from the same registered business address. The registered agent at that address was a lawyer who also appeared, in a different filing, as a non-voting director of a shell company 2 tiers above Northfield itself. It wasn't illegal. Or rather, it wasn't provably illegal in the way that would survive 5 minutes in front of a judge. But it was the kind of structure that existed for reasons, and the reasons were not the ones anyone would say out loud. He thought about the health authorities, 8 of them, across the province, hospitals in Prince George and Kamloops and Kelowna and the island, supply chains that kept operating rooms stocked and rural clinics running, and lab equipment moving from the lower mainland to communities that couldn't replace them quickly if something went wrong. He thought about what happened when a logistics contractor optimized for margin rather than reliability. He had written about it once in the 2021 journal piece, using a case study from Alberta that had taken him 3 months to research and that had bothered him long after he'd submitted it. He sat at the kitchen table until midnight. Then he called Celeste's number. She picked up on the second ring. "I'll do 3 weeks," he said. "My hours, I'm home by 3:15 every day." There was a small pause. Then she said, "Thank you." They did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He worked from the library most mornings, sometimes from the kitchen table after Maisie left for school. He came into the Merrick offices 3 times in 3 weeks, always in the early morning, and he always left before noon. What he built was not complicated. Complexity was easy to admire and hard to defend. What he built was airtight. He drafted a formal disclosure request to the BC Procurement Office, citing Clause 14.3 of the Logistics Services Tender and the specific subsidiary relationship between Northfield's parent and Meridian Advisory. The request did not accuse anyone of anything. It simply asked, in language borrowed from 2 precedent cases in the provincial record, for full declaration of all relationships that might bear on a committee member's recusal obligations. The request was a matter of public record the moment it was filed. Once it was filed, the review committee chair had 2 choices: recuse herself entirely from the appeal process or face a formal conflict inquiry that would pause the entire contract award until it was resolved. Either way, Northfield's timeline advantage evaporated. The second thing he built was a renewal case for the Merrick contract itself. Not a competitive pitch, a public interest record. 7 years of performance data across all 8 health authorities, on-time rates, substitution ratios, emergency response records, including a 48-hour reroute during a flooding event in 2022 that had kept 3 rural clinics operational when the primary highway was closed. He asked Francis Pell, who had been his indirect contact throughout the 3 weeks, and who he had come to understand ran the actual architecture of Merrick's institutional memory to pull the incident reports. She pulled them in 40 minutes and organized them in a way that told a story without having to say one. He wrote the case around them. He did not use the word competitor once. The third thing he built was a letter. Not a legal document. A letter, 2 pages, addressed to the Deputy Minister of Health from Celeste, but drafted by him and refined by her in a single long phone call on a Thursday night, while Maisie was at a sleepover at her school friend's house down the street. The letter did not argue. It described what the contract covered and what it had cost Merrick to maintain reliability through the years it had been in place, and what the transition risk would look like if a new contractor came in with no operational relationships in place with the health authorities. It was the kind of letter that was easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention and impossible to dismiss once you were. Celeste read the final draft at 11 o'clock on a Friday night and called him. She said, "This is very good," he said. "Francis organized it. I just put the sentences in order." There was a small quiet on the line. She said, "Nathan." He had not expected her to use his name. They had been careful with names, both of them, in the polite and cautious way that people are careful when they are standing close to something they haven't decided yet what to call. He said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you. For the coffee, for all of it." He said, "You bought me a coffee last time." She said, "I meant the first one, the one I didn't say anything." She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night." The procurement office filed its acknowledgement of the disclosure request on a Tuesday morning. By noon, the review committee chair had submitted a voluntary full recusal from the appeal window. By the following Monday, Northfield had withdrawn their bid. Celeste sent him a text at 9:08 in the morning. Just 2 words. It held. He was at the library. He read the message 3 times. He put his phone face down on the table and looked out the window at Columbia Street for a while. Frances Pell called him at 2 o'clock. She said Celeste wanted to speak with him and asked if Thursday morning worked. He said yes. He picked Maisie up. She told him that Buttons, the rabbit in her classroom, had finally let Liam Kerrigan hold him properly, because Liam had figured out you had to be slow about it. Nathan said, "Sometimes people figure things out." "Rabbits are pretty patient." "Yeah," he said, "they are." Thursday morning was clear and cold, the kind of Vancouver November morning that looked like a photograph of itself. He drove into the city. He had ironed a shirt. He had not mentioned to himself that he had ironed a shirt. The Merrick Logistics office was on the 14th floor of a building on West Georgia. He had been there 4 times in 4 years of employment and never on the executive floor, which was the 15th. The elevator went to 15. Frances met him at the door. She walked him down a corridor to a corner office with windows on 2 sides. The North Shore Mountains were visible in the gap between the buildings, the way they appear in this city like an afterthought that makes everything else look temporary. Celeste was standing at the window. She turned when he came in. He said, "Ms. Merrick." She said, "I've been meaning to ask you to stop calling me that." He said, "Celeste." She said it correctly. She sat down on the small sofa near the window and gestured to the chair across from it, the one that wasn't behind the desk. He sat. She said, "The board met this morning. We're adding a contract compliance function to the company structure. Something that sits between operations and legal, focused on procurement integrity and risk documentation. It doesn't exist yet. The job description doesn't exist yet." He waited. She said, "I'd like you to design it, and then I'd like you to run it." He looked out the window. A seagull landed on the ledge and regarded them both with complete indifference. He said, "I need to be home by 3:15. She said, "I know." "That's already in what I'm thinking," he said. "And I'm not taking a title that requires me to be available on weekends unless something is actually on fire," she said. "Defined as." He said, "I'll know it when I see it. So will you?" She almost smiled, not quite. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The morning at Tim Hortons, your cards were both declined." She said, "Yes." He said, "That doesn't happen to CEOs very often." She said, "I'd been in Toronto for a week and a half and my purse was stolen at Pearson on the way home. The bank froze everything pending verification. I had $10 in coins in the bottom of my bag, and I'd already spent 8 of them on parking." He said, "You were flying home from Toronto with $10 in coins." She said, "I had a company card. I had just used it to pay for a $700 dinner with a client the night before, and I had somehow not thought to get cash at the airport." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So we were both broke." She said, "In entirely different ways, yes." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay?" He said yes. She put out her hand, he shook it. Her hand was dry and the grip was direct, and it was exactly the kind of handshake that meant what it said. Frances appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. She set them on the table between them and removed herself without comment. Celeste picked up her cup. He picked up his. She said, "You know, Frances worked in your building once, a long time ago. She was in the municipal contracts division in the same office where you were doing the regional review work in 2018. He said, "I don't think I'd remember." She said she doesn't expect you to. She just wanted you to know that she read the 2021 piece when it came out. She told me last week that it was the best work she'd read in infrastructure risk in 5 years. He looked at his coffee. He said, "Tell her I said thank you." Celeste said, "Tell her yourself. She'll be around." At 3:10 that afternoon, Nathan pulled up in front of Maisie's school. She came out in her red puffer jacket with her backpack on and her boots untied, carrying a piece of construction paper carefully in both hands so it wouldn't fold. She handed it to him through the car window before she got in. It was a drawing of a building. A tall building with a lot of windows, drawn in blue marker with what appeared to be mountains behind it, indicated by a row of triangles. He said, "What's this?" She said, "It's where you're going to work. Mrs. Okoro said we could draw something we were excited about." He said, "How did you know about the building?" She said, "You ironed your shirt this morning, Daddy. You only do that for important things." He looked at the drawing for a moment. The building had a flag on top of it. He hadn't noticed that at first. A small flag in red marker, the kind of flag a 6-year-old draws on a building to signal that someone important lives there. He put the drawing on the dashboard. He started the car. She buckled herself in. She looked out the window. She said, "Is the lady coming for pancakes again?" He said, "I don't know yet, Bug, maybe." She said, "I hope so. She does the syrup right." He pulled out into traffic. The mountains were showing above the roofline of the school, clear and very close the way they get in November when the air is cold enough to be honest about distances. He thought about Celeste's hand on the drawing board that morning, pointing to the clause in the contract without touching it. He thought about Maisie's boots on the front steps of the school every morning, untied and going in. He thought about the $40 on the counter at Tim Hortons on a morning when he had been, in every measurable sense, emptied out, and how it had not felt like a choice, but like the only thing that made sense to do. He had not made that gesture to get anything back. He had understood that before he understood anything else. But he was beginning to understand that some things returned anyway, not as payment, not as reward, but as proof that the version of yourself you chose to be on your worst morning was the version that lasted. The flag on Maisie's drawing caught the afternoon light from the windshield for a moment, red against the gray November sky coming in through the glass, and he drove them home.